Something else that hit the airwaves was Christian Horner and Red Bull making some positive comments about yours truly, Daniel Ricciardo. He believes that Ricciardo is getting his mojo back after returning to Red Bull this year, and he's confirmed that the 8-time Grand Prix winner is set to test for the team later this year. Mojo, and obviously I know, Nate, that you know Daniel well. What do you think Christian Horner means when he says he's getting his mojo back?
I think he's been watching Austin Powers because there's a movie, isn't there? And Austin Powers about his mojo. Not sure if that's quite the same mojo he's talking about.
I hope not.
But I think it all comes back down to kind of the big reason, the big kind of question mark around Ricciardo for the last few years, right? Which was what happened to the Ricciardo of 2018, 2017, especially when you're in Christian Horner's shoes, because the Ricciardo that last worked at Red Bull was a beast. You know, he in certain points, in certain races, if there was a sniff of victory, the guy you kind of wanted in those situations often was Ricciardo. A lot of his wins, he kind of came from nowhere, came through the field, and would win races. And then obviously Renault, he had some really good stints there. But McLaren, other than Monza, if you take Monza where he won away, it was just baffling. No one really understood why he wasn't the same guy, why he wasn't able to fight with Lando. And there's been some interesting comments Horner's made as well, where he said that as soon as they got him in the simulator, they realized he'd picked up habits since leaving Red Bull that he didn't have when he was at the team. So, you know, whether that's a driving style technique, whether it's the way he feeds back information, you know, he didn't go into too much detail. But I think what he means, you know, specifically about Mojo is there's clearly something that went missing for Danny Ric over the past 2 seasons, especially last year. You know, it just got worse and worse and worse last season from the first race. And I think that a lot of that, I think what most people read when they see that is confidence. You know, he's always been that happy, bubbly kind of guy. But you do feel that last year at times he was doing it in spite of not feeling that way, not feeling that good about how things were. So, and it did, again, we've talked about when we spoke to him in New York, but he did just seem so much more at ease, didn't he? Even then. And that was, he'd only had the new Red Bull kit for a month. So interesting to hear that from Horner. And I think as much as anything, if you're another team boss on the grid, you're probably hearing Horner say that. And I think that, you know, if Ricciardo doesn't end up racing for Red Bull, which, you know, I personally think's unlikely looking at it right now, I think the biggest thing for Ricciardo, he's going to be looking at it thinking, I want to race again. I want to race in Formula One. So comments like that, if you're another team boss, obviously Ricciardo's going to test later this year. You're going to look at that and say, well, if we're getting the Ricciardo, you know, the 2018 spec Ricciardo, the 2019 Ricciardo, even the Ricciardo of 2020 for Renault in that COVID season, you'll be happy about that. But what you don't want is you don't want to spend money on the Ricciardo we saw, kind of the damaged goods Ricciardo, if you want to say that, you know, where clearly there just wasn't something wasn't clicking. So interesting to see that. And I think it is fascinating as well, because the whole question mark around Ricciardo is how close is he to actually racing for Red Bull? Obviously, something needs to happen to Perez or to Max to step in if he were to step in. But the fact that Horner's saying that, it suggests that they would be happy right now if they needed him to turn to him, which I think is a big statement.
Sure.
So, and I think it'd be good. It's good news for F1 fans as well, because he's such a popular guy, and I do feel like F1's been a bit, you know, it's been. I think his absence has been felt. I don't know if you both agree with that, but I feel like it. You know, I know he's been around, but he's not really been as present as obviously in previous years.
Certainly from a personality standpoint, but let's go down this rabbit hole, because this is obviously a episode of exercises. Lawrence, based on the drivers that we currently have on the grid and their current contracts, where could we see Daniel Ricciardo return if, say, it was going to happen next season?
There aren't many options at the top teams. So if you look at Mercedes, we're kind of assuming that Lewis is going to sign a contract going forward. And that would, mean that they've got 2 drivers. Ferrari have 2 drivers under contract, Sainz and Leclerc. Red Bull obviously do. Then we look at McLaren, well, he's not going back there. Aston Martin, Fernando's under contract for at least another year after that. Lance Stroll, we discussed earlier. Where else can we go? Alpine, well, they had an option last year. If they wanted to, they could have pursued him, and they didn't. They signed up Pierre Gasly and Esteban Ocon, and despite the 2 of them crashing in Australia, I think they're pretty impressed with what Pierre's been able to do, and Esteban's been a kind of long-term prospect of So then we start going much further down the grid and you get to, well, Alpha Tauri, that's a junior Red Bull team. Doesn't make a huge amount of sense for Daniel to end up back there because, again, I think, had he really wanted to make that happen this year, he could have. Haas, possibly. There's a possibility there if either Kevin or Nico have a bad season or decide at the end of it that they actually quite like being away from F1, then Daniel can slot back in there. But again, Daniel had the opportunity to have conversations with Gunther and apparently just didn't pick up his phone, so didn't reply to messages or whatever the story was. So it's not looking great, but it's never as simple as that. If you look at Checo before he went to Red Bull, where he was at Force India, won a race in Sakir in an unfancy car, and then opened a door for himself, to get that Red Bull drive when they looked to get rid of Alex Albon. So these things do happen. They do turn around, and I think right now it's quite hard to speculate on where he would be. But I actually was in the interview. There was three of us talking to Daniel on the Thursday in Australia, where he said that the signs are pointing towards him wanting to go back to a Formula One drive. And while it's a question that we all had on our notebooks ready to ask, he was the one that brought it up. We said we had 30 minutes with Daniel, so we were just kind of asking him stuff about how it's going, what he's getting up to, and all that kind of stuff. And he was the guy that brought up, no, by the way, all the signs are pointing towards it. I want to make it happen. So that will be the big question. How much does he want to make it happen? How far is he willing to go down the grid to make it happen? In that interview, he suggested not that far down the grid. His ambitions haven't changed. He still wants to be in a car that can compete for podiums, wins eventually, and certainly be top half of the grid. So it's going to be tricky. But I think, he was putting it out there. And Nate, you're absolutely right. The other thing he mentioned was going in the simulator and basically realizing that, in a good car, this could be really good fun. And he's really, really excited about getting in this year's Red Bull later this year to do some Pirelli tire testing, which under normal circumstances, the 20 drivers who drive week in, week out really don't care about the Pirelli tire testing unless they think they can gain some kind of advantage. It's pretty much, one of the things they'd do anything to get out of. I mean, in previous years, they have done that, and Pirelli had to put in some rules to make sure they actually had relevant drivers capable of pushing the cars hard enough for them to get decent tire data back. But yeah, Daniel is definitely capable of that, and he is so excited about getting in that car because he's basically going to be getting into one of the best Formula One cars arguably ever, but certainly over the last kind of 10, 20 years or so, and the chance to wring its neck and really find out what he's got in him away from all the handling traits that the McLaren had that he didn't like, couldn't click with, couldn't get himself around to. He's going to get back in a Red Bull that has all the things that he wants, and he'll have some idea of how close he is to Checo and Max, and those are some very good yard posts to measure yourself against.
It's going to be so telling, right? And there's going to be a lot of pressure, I feel like, that comes with that day, because that's your opportunity to tell other teams, I've still got it in the right machinery. And if he falters, then I think, as you put it, Nate, people are going to say, yeah, I'm going to steer clear of possibly damaged goods. So I think that day is going to be unbelievably telling for Daniel Ricciardo and his future in the sport.
Yeah, big time. And I hope it goes well for him, because I think he can come back and do well. But I think Lawrence is right, and every indication I've ever had from speaking to Ricciardo or people close to him is that, really, if looking at it now, I think I actually have more and more respect the more you think about it, that Ricciardo could have really pursued a seat at a quote unquote lower team down the grid. And it was clear that he was like, unless I'm going to a better car, like Lawrence said, he didn't want it. So I think that ultimately is going to be what decides it. And I wonder if he sits out for another year waiting for a big seat, you wonder how long, will those teams even go to Daniel if he's had another year out? So you do feel like the window's closing, but like as last year showed, an F1 drive market is so difficult to predict. 1 minute everything looks like it's fine, and then Vettel retires and Alonso's at Aston, and you're like, okay, what's going on? So anything can happen, anything could open up, and we don't know what things will look like. So yeah, he's put himself in a good spot, and I think that 6 months ago even, a lot of people were second guessing his decision to sit out. So it's turning out a lot differently, to how a lot of people thought. And he deserves a lot of credit for that, because he's kind of the guy that's made that happen.
Anything can happen. That's why we absolutely adore this sport.
As Murray Walker, the commentator, used to say, or said once, he said, anything can happen in Formula One, and it usually does, which is just a great quote.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.